Hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to another lecture on information security. Today is also our first lecture that dives more deeply into cryptography, our first big block of topics. And for the first lecture, I've picked one of the security goals that we've met in the previous lecture, namely authenticity. So we're going to look at authentication schemes today, or more specifically about symmetric authentication schemes. We'll get to what that means later. So for those who feel a bit disoriented, here is a short overview of where we are. So last week we had a first introductory lecture where we introduced some terminology and one very basic principle of cryptology. Today we start trying to tackle our first security goal with cryptography, namely authenticity. To do this, we will first need to talk a bit about what secrets actually are. Because they will be the basis for much of what we're doing. So we'll talk about the concept of entropy. And we'll also cover two symmetric schemes that are used for providing authenticity. Next week, we are going to look at confidentiality and also look at different schemes that achieve this, as well as looking inside the primitives that are the basic building blocks. And the week after, we'll finally get to asymmetric cryptography. So here we will see how we can actually exchange the secrets we're talking about here, how to sign stuff and other topics. And there is a fourth lecture which didn't fit on this slide, which covers application-oriented topics. So let's have a look again at what we did last week. We were first talking a bit more generally about information security and the concept of assets. So an asset was anything that we wanted to protect against an adversary. So that was the difference between security and safety. Security has an adversary, an attacker. And we talked about this chain of things that finally lead to an attack. And we said that we want to break this chain at some point. And we found that cryptography is one of the mathematical core building blocks that we can use to achieve this. And in particular, we said that cryptography defines algorithms which can be used to transform data in a way such that it can afterwards be transmitted over an insecure channel without violating the security properties of the data. And this shifted the burden of protecting the data to another item, the key. And instead we now have to protect this key. And in particular we had a look at a basic principle about these algorithms. And to recall in a bit more detail what we did and to get you all awake, I prepared a small recap quiz. So this is going to be done via Menti, which hopefully won't disappoint us today. Let's see. And I have a couple of questions, I think 4 or so, that cover some of the topics last week. So if you join now, then you can participate. I'll wait a couple of seconds until some more of you are here. But I see where you were already very well prepared. Judging from how quickly you appear, there's already, wow, almost 90 people here. Let's wait a couple more seconds before we start with the first question. Okay, it looks to have settled down a bit. 5 more seconds or so. And now let's head off to our first question. So you'll usually have on my screen about 20 to 25 seconds of time to answer a question. Due to the latency, it's going to be a bit shorter for you, so something like 15 seconds or so probably. There's one slightly longer question where you have a bit more time. Okay, so let's have a look. As we've reached 124 participants already, that's great. So let's see. If you answer fast, you get slightly more points. So which one of these is not a classical security property? A, confidentiality, B, integrity, C, fidelity, or E, authenticity? Okay, let's see. There is a great sense of unity among you. So you all agreed, or most of you agreed, that indeed fidelity is not a classical security property in information security. That's great. Okay, let's head on to the next question. It says six questions here, but I hope we don't get six. So who is the villain in cryptography? What's their name? Is it Alice, Bob, Victor, or Eve? Okay, there's great agreement again. It's indeed Eve, short for the eavesdropper, but you can also just remember evil. So to introduce the other people again, Alice and Bob were just trying to talk. And Victor is a guy who appears in the context of authentication protocols like we talk about today. So the V is for verifier. He is usually the guy who verifies some sort of authenticity. Let's head on to the next one. What does Kerckhoffs's principle say? A. Security by obscurity. B. The crypto system is public. C. The key is public. Or D. The early bird catches the bug. Okay, it appears this one here was slightly less clear, but the majority is still right. Indeed, it says that the crypto system should be public. On the contrary, the key is what we should protect. I know that there is something or a concept called a public key, but there's also always a corresponding secret key which must not be public. And here, this one, security by obscurity, is actually the opposite of what Kerckhoffs's principle says. So it's the counter position. Okay, last question. So you see the counter is a bit off, but we get the right questions. What can be safely transmitted even on an untrusted channel? The ciphertext, the plaintext, the secret key, or a hash value? Yes, indeed, it's the ciphertext. So the ciphertext is our transformed version of the plaintext, which we can transmit over an insecure channel. The plaintext not, because the word plaintext is usually used in the context of confidentiality, which always means the plaintext should remain secret. The key, we already talked about that, should also be secret. And there is the hash value. That's something we haven't talked about yet, but we will talk about it today. And we will see that actually the hash value should also not be transmitted over an untrusted, manipulable channel. Okay, so let's have a look at the leaderboard. Okay, it looks like a couple of people are pretty much tied and one only by being very fast. So congratulations, MC, for beating your colleagues by a few milliseconds. Okay, that's great. So let's head on to the actual lecture. So what's the outline for today? I already mentioned it briefly, but let's look again. So we'll talk about 3 parts actually. 2 of them I already mentioned. These ones here are cryptographic algorithms that we're going to discuss. Both of them provide authenticity of data in a way, but one is without a key and one is with a key. And we're going to look at the details of those mostly on hash functions, but also a basic introduction to message authentication codes, or MECs. But before we do that, we're going to have a look at what they can actually be used for. And that's entity authentication protocols, which means somebody authenticates to somebody else as a person. And we'll look at two variants of this, so-called weak and strong authentication. Where weak authentication isn't necessarily always weak, but it's just called like that. Okay, so let's first have a few introductory words before we dive into this part. So let's talk about what we mean by authentication in cryptography. And the reason why we need to talk about that is because we actually mean two things by it. There is so-called entity authentication and message authentication. Entity authentication is about entities, which means people or devices. So one communication endpoint that is trying to prove to somebody else that they have a certain identity. And there's a verifier, Victor, who wants to verify this. And an identity in cryptography usually means being the possessor of some secret, like a password or a key. So entity authentication is about people authenticating to somebody. But we also have message authentication, where we talk about messages and not people. So in particular, we want to verify the source of certain messages. So for example, if we receive a website, we want to verify that it's actually from the right server or website owner. And we're interested in integrity, which means we want to verify that the message has not been modified while it has been transmitted. Same thing, we want to receive exactly the website we ordered and not some manipulated version of it. So these two are really two sides of the same coin. You cannot have authenticity if you don't also have integrity, if we talk about messages, because a manipulated message is no longer the original message. And you might be wondering why we start with this maybe less popular aspect or less well-known, or if you think about cryptography, or you usually think about encrypting, which means protecting confidentiality. But I still decided to focus on authenticity first, and that's because this is the kind of crypto where we actually see the output of crypto algorithms in real life. In confidentiality, you usually don't even notice it's there. I mean, your hard drive is encrypted, you don't even see that, you don't notice that. The only thing you do notice is that you have to authenticate to it for it to be decrypted. And in authenticity, we actually even see the outputs of crypto algorithms in some cases. So I've picked a few examples here. One that probably many of you have already seen is file checksums. So for example, you're downloading a big file from some provider, such as, for example, a Linux image. I think that's the example here. Yes, it's a Debian image. So you get this Debian image, for example, via some file sharing client or so. But how do you verify that you got the right thing? That you haven't received a malicious, manipulated version of this Linux image? Well, one of the ways you can verify it is because on the website, you usually also find some information that you can use for verifying the authenticity. This includes things like these MD5 sums or SHA-1 or SHA-2 sums. These are all hashes of this message here. So they are supposed to allow you to validate that you've received the correct image. So the assumption here is you trust the website. The website has HTTPS and everything, but you don't get this download from the website. You get it over a separate insecure channel, like for example a torrent. So afterwards, once you've downloaded this, you can locally recompute these validation values, which look like these long hexadecimal strings, and you can compare it to the ones you find on the website. And if they match, you've got the right and unmodified file. So that's the basic idea. So this is one example where you actually see the output of a crypto algorithm. It's actually pretty long in this example because I've picked SHA-512, I think. There's also another example where you see the outputs of hash algorithms. You might even have typed them before, and that's if you've been using Git. Because if you commit to Git, you usually get this commit ID here, which uniquely verifies or identifies your commit. And you can, for example, use it to pull a particular commit. And this commit ID is also a hash value of certain parts of the repository, like its history, its files, and some metadata. So here you also see this, and you often type a part of it because you want to retrieve a particular one. And you always hope that you've typed enough in the beginning to be sure that there is only one example of an ID which starts with these digits. Speaking about short outputs of cryptographic algorithms, like the first digits here, there is also another case where you've probably already typed the output of a crypto algorithm. And that is if you've been using two-factor authentication with the help of mobile TANs, for example. Or also some authenticator apps like Google Authenticator. So you probably know these. You can enable them on many websites. If you log in, you not only provide your passwords, but you also need to do something with a device you own. For example, confirming on the device that the device shows you exactly the same ID as on the website. Or you might have to type one of the numbers that you get from your device or from the app into the website as an additional authentication factor. And these are actually not the outputs of hash algorithms, but of message authentication codes, which we'll meet later today. So let's have a look at protocols which use these algorithms, at entity authentication protocols. I see there's already a first question, so let's have a look at that before we dive into the rest. This is actually an organizational question, namely, will the KU be online like the lecture, and is it viewable later? Yes, it is. There is another question. Can you tell us what went wrong at Facebook this week? Well, I think a lot of things went wrong, but it's not the content of this lecture. Will you get a repository in the KU? Yes, you will, but the KU questions will be answered in the evening, in the afternoon in the KU lecture. Then there's a question, what is actually being hashed on a Git commit? The main thing that is hashed is the files that are currently in there and the history, where the history can actually be summarized in the commit ID of the previous hash. And there's also a little bit of metadata. I've just recently read a discussion and I don't remember exactly which details of it were stored and which ones not. So I think some of the modification dates and so on were stored, but I don't remember the details. But we will see later in this lecture how to incrementally update a hash such that you don't have to hash everything again. So you don't have to, for example in Git, hash all the previous versions of each file again, but you can just take a small fingerprint of the history, the current diff or state, hash that together and get a new fingerprint that represents all the history for the next time. Where can you find the slides? They're on the course website, and the course website URL was on the first slide here, so that probably won't help you, but it's also in the video description. So it's iaik.tugraz.at/infosec. There you find a table with the YouTube link and the slide PDF. The KU will be recorded. Well, it will be streamed on YouTube, so yes. So it's like a blockchain. Well, actually, yes, but it's the other way around. A blockchain has a lot of similarities with a hash function. It also uses hash functions internally, but yeah, this concept is a lot older than blockchains and can be used in a much wider variety of contexts and without proof of work and stuff like that. But yes, a blockchain also does that. It takes a fingerprint of all the previous history, adds some new data, and produces a new fingerprint for that. But blockchains also involve an additional building block, namely signatures, which we're not going to talk about today. But you will find this context or this concept of incrementally updating something based on a previous fingerprint very often. It's also the basis of how to actually build a hash function, as we will see. Okay, thanks for your questions, and let's head back to the slides and talk about entity authentication protocols. Okay, so what are we talking about? We are talking about getting access to a certain device or service by authenticating yourself. So there's actually two aspects: authenticating, so proving that you're yourself, and identification, which means informing the communication partner who you are. So it's like identification is I provide my username, and authentication the password in a simplified way. And this is used either by itself or as part of many communication protocols. So for example, even when you build up an HTTPS connection to a website or to a web server, you also implicitly authenticate to them, or they authenticate to you. And you won't even notice that because it's underneath the hood. So there doesn't always have to be a human in the loop. It can also just be machines talking to each other. Now we have two entities here. We have the prover, who claims to have a certain identity. They are also often called Peggy, the prover, in crypto. And we have the verifier, also often called Victor, who wants evidence of the prover's identity. And this evidence can take several forms, and we call these forms authentication factors. So here's another question for you, namely, which authentication factors do you know? By which means can a user authenticate? So this is not a quiz, you have more time to answer this, but maybe you have some suggestions. So passwords are definitely a good way. Somebody is well informed, we'll get back to that in a moment. You can also authenticate by a key, indeed. So a key is like a sort of machine readable or machine generated password. We have fingerprints, that's a great idea. Handysignatur I saw, so that's having a device and the access credentials for this device. You can also use more than one method, so that's two-factor authentication. You can have these TANs that we saw earlier. Let's see what more we have. So I saw challenge authentication protocols, we'll get to those. More specifications of different keys, like owning an SSH key to access a Git repository, for example. What else do we have here? These are moving around so fast. Eye recognition is another example of biometric authentication. What else do we have? Security questions. Yes, so that's a sort of a variant of passwords, which are typically used to help you recover your own password. So it's like a backup password. What else do we have here? Let's let the kitten in while I search for things that I haven't seen yet. I see token here. So that's owning a particular device which has some information on it. Hardware IDs is a good idea. So also machines can authenticate to each other. Google Auth is an example of a way to generate second factors. And bionicle, I guess you mean biometrical. So that's like a summarizing term for all kinds of body-related authentication factors. So which ones did I miss? Voice is another. Voice and Face ID are two more examples of biometrics. Possessing an email is an interesting one. So having access to an email, yes. Geheimfrage, so that's a version of the secret questions. And I guess smart card. That's another interesting one. Iris scan, yeah, I think I've now read most of them. So that's a number of great ideas. Let's have a look at how we can categorize them. You might see the tail of a cat appear in a moment in the video. Let's see if she walks far enough. Okay, so thanks for your inputs here. This is actually for the break afterwards. Let's hide that for the moment. And let's have instead a look at authentication factors. So somebody already has mentioned these words here: knows, has, and is. And these are indeed three facets of how you can authenticate. It can be a piece of information that you know, such as a password or a PIN. It can be something that you possess, like a smart card or a banking card or a USB token or a smartphone. Or it can be what you are, meaning biometric information like your fingerprint, eye, or voice. And you can combine any of those. So that's then called multi-factor authentication. So for example, you possess your banking card and you know the corresponding PIN. Or when you log into a website, you have a password and you have the corresponding mobile TAN. I see there's one more question. Let's look at that. So the first question is, why is two-factor authentication often only using lowercase letters and numbers, but not including uppercase letters too? I guess you're referring to the letters you have to type in. I guess the most obvious answer might be usability, but this really depends a lot on which system you're talking about. We'll talk later at how to quantify how much information is in a particular string. And the main idea of having you type in the second factor is to represent this amount of information in a way that is as user-friendly as possible. And it's more user-friendly to use only uppercase or only lowercase letters than to mix them, because humans will make more mistakes. So it might be better to make the ID a tiny bit longer, but use only one case of letters. Do you think that passwords have a future with post-quantum computers? Well, that mixes actually a number of issues. First of them, passwords have been pronounced dead for years, I guess. So years ago, people already said, well, in 5 years, we won't have passwords anymore because we have so many great alternatives. And they're still sticking around. The second question, or the second part of the question, is about quantum computers, which can indeed break some authentication schemes faster than normal computers. However, the crypto that's used in password verification is not one of them. So a quantum computer actually doesn't help you much with brute forcing passwords. What would help you more is a dedicated device that is able to execute the kind of password hashing function that you use very quickly, which is why the functions try to protect against that exactly. But don't worry, quantum computers will not be the reason in case your passwords are ever broken. Okay, so how do we use these authentication factors? I'm using this as an example to show how in cryptography we write down protocols, or one of the ways how we write down protocols. Because the password protocol is maybe one of the easiest ones that you can imagine. So how does it work? There is a setup phase and there is an identification phase. In the setup phase, the verifier and the prover get to know each other. So in practice, this usually means a user chooses a password, which are denoted by K, like a key, because it is Alice's key. And they communicate this to the verifier. So the server, well, let's call him Bob in this context. And they store the identity of Alice, so A, together with her key, so her password. That's the setup phase. And a very naive implementation of the identification phase would be, well, Alice wants to prove that she is Alice, so she sends her username and her password along to Bob. That's it. And Bob accepts the identification if this username and password are actually stored in their place like that. So I said this is a very naive version because this has quite a number of problems. One of the first problems is that you're actually sending along your key, so your password, along an untrusted channel. So this is already a problem to start with. There are also, so whenever Eve has intercepted this message once, they can replay it at any later stage to also authenticate to Bob as Alice. So in other words, if somebody has your password, they can log into Bob as often and at any point in time that they like. There is a second vulnerability, and that is because Bob needs to store all these identification values or these passwords. And this stored table is sort of vulnerable, particularly if Bob is a big server, has loads of users, loads of passwords, and if they're all stored in plain text, they are a very, very interesting target for somebody looking for credentials. They might not even want to attack the server B with it. They might know that users tend to reuse their passwords in other places, so they might attack one weak service B, grab all the passwords from there, and go to some more interesting, stronger service and try whether Alice has the same password there. That's the second issue. And the third issue, I'm not saying this list is complete, but one third issue is the question how strong this key is. So how strong the password is. And one way to measure that, or to estimate it more accurately, is looking at the so-called entropy of the password. So I want to have a quick look at what that is. This is a mathematical concept, so we won't dive into too much detail, but I want to give you some intuition about it. And also some intuition about how some websites try to estimate the entropy of your password, and whether that's a good idea. So, what is entropy? Essentially, it's a measure for the amount of randomness or the amount of information that a random variable possesses. So, it's saying something about the distribution of a random variable. So the process how the random variable was chosen. As a simple example, if you generate a long bit string, so let's say a 128-bit string, where each of the 128 bits is chosen independently and uniformly randomly. What does that mean? Well, uniformly randomly means that each bit is 50% a 0, 50% a 1. And independently means that each of the bits is chosen independently of the others. So the fact that the first bit, for example, is a 0 doesn't influence the probability that the second bit is a 0. So if you do this, if this is your selection process, this means you have a total of 2 to the 128 possible output values, and each of them has the same probability. So for example, 00000 has exactly the same probability as 01001011 and so on. So even though to us one of them looks more random, they actually have exactly the same probability to be drawn, so they're equally likely. If we look at such an example, this has an entropy of 128 bits. So I guess this explains where the bits of entropy take their name from the simplest case, namely random bit strings. But this is only true for the case where each of the values of the 2 to the 128 values has the same probability. If some of the values are more likely than others, for example, if you have a biased coin that you use to generate this string, and it produces more zeros than ones, then a string with more zeros is more likely than one with fewer zeros. If you have a biased process like that, then the entropy is less than the full 128 bits that it could achieve. So the situation that all values are equally likely is the best case. It has the highest entropy, and the more biased it is, the lower the entropy is. High entropy strong, low entropy weak. Now we saw here that this is about the process how you generate something. So in particular, the entropy does not measure the randomness of a particular value. Like if you get a 000, you don't know what the entropy of this value is. It only measures the entropy of the process how you got there. Or in other words, the distribution. Let's have a look at the question that we have here. I'll answer that at a later point. It's again about quantum computers. Okay, so let's have a look at a famous example which also tries to explain how entropy can be applied to estimate the entropy of passwords, so the security of passwords. So this is from an XKCD comic, which discusses two different strategies how you could choose your password. And we will see here the application of this entropy concept. So the first strategy that this comic analyzes is the strategy that you choose a random word, so a very uncommon word, like in this case, troubadour. So not gibberish, but uncommon. This has a certain base entropy. How can we evaluate what this entropy is? Well, we have to have a look at how big the list of words is from which it was supposedly chosen. So in this specific example here, I think it was chosen from a list of 10,000 words, but let me just verify. So the bits of information are here represented on top with these boxes. So one box is one bit of entropy. And if I count correctly, then this is something like 13 to 15 bits or so, which would mean somewhere in the area between 10,000 and 40,000 words. So from such a big word list, you pick a word. And assuming that all of the words are equally likely, the entropy of one of the words is logarithm to base 2 of the size of this word list. So let's assume we have a word list of 10,000 words. Then the entropy of one randomly picked word from this word list is a log 2 of 10,000. So how big is that? Log 2 of 10,000 is 13 point something. So this would mean a 13-bit entropy. And notice that this is completely independent of how long the words on the word list are. It only depends on the size of the word list. So since this 13 bits is not a very high entropy, a user could try to improve the entropy by introducing some manipulations. For example, they could choose to write the first letter in caps lock or not. So these are two possible choices, and log 2 of 2 is 1, so this is 1 bit of entropy. You could also do some common substitutions, like for example, replacing an O by a 0 or an A by a 4. In each of the places where such a letter appears, you have two choices, either you replace it or not. So this gives 1 bit, and this gives 1 bit, and this one gives 1 bit. You notice that here we replaced and here we didn't. So that gives us an additional 3 bits of entropy. Then we can add, so usually the passwords require some punctuation sign at the end. So let's add that. How much entropy does it give? Well, that depends on how many possible punctuation symbols there are to choose from. Assuming that there are something like 8 to 10 symbols that we can choose, like a period or a colon or an ampersand, we have 4 bits of entropy. Plus a number from 0 to 10, that's approximately 2 to the 3, so approximately 8 options. A bit more than that, but we don't count half bits in this picture. And you can swap the order of the two. So that's another bit of entropy. So if we count all of this together, the total number of options that we would have is 10,000 for the word, times 2 for the caps lock, times 8 in this case for the substitutions, times 10, times, I don't know, 16 or so, times 2. So that's a big number, and log 2 of that number is the same as the sum of all these individual bits here. So if you add them together, you'd get a total of, in this example, 28 bits of entropy, roughly. Now, how secure is 28 bits of entropy? That depends on how strong your attacker is, so how many guesses per second they can verify. And assuming that they can verify 1,000 guesses per second, they would have brute forced your password after about 3 days. There's a second concept that's illustrated here, and that is simply choosing a higher number of words, so a longer length in total, from a slightly smaller word list. So not a very complicated word. We see that here we have 11 bits of entropy. 11 bits of entropy means this word was chosen from a list of 2 to the power 11 entries, so that's about 2,000 entries. So more common words. And again, you can add the entropy from the individual words, because in total you have 2,000 times 2,000 times 2,000 times 2,000 options to choose this password. And they conclude that in this particular example, this strategy actually gives you a higher entropy. Now, I don't want to put too much emphasis, so the author of the comic very much favors this strategy. I don't think that's the main message of the comic. For me, the main message is, how do you judge the strength of your password? And in particular, you notice that there was one very important assumption underneath all this, namely that we actually randomly made all these choices, where each outcome would have equally high probability. So some of you may already have done that. Like, for example, you could choose such a password by, for example, throwing some dice and then opening the dictionary on the right page and picking a particular word on that and really sticking to it and not taking the one next to it because it looks nice or something like that. But generally, humans are really poor at actually being random. Computers are much better at that, which is why a computer-generated password makes it much easier to actually assess the entropy. Because, for example, if you use a password manager that can generate your passwords, you can actually select the strategy there. For example, you can ask it to generate a password of 12 digits of numbers and letters, and then it will actually give you a password where each password of this length is equally likely. So it has the highest entropy. For a human chosen password, this is really, really hard to measure. So for example, if you use your pet's name as a password or so, well, you can't really measure how good that is. It's probably not very good. Okay, some more questions. Let's look at those. Let's see if any of those are immediately relevant to the topic here. So let's look at this suggestion here. So this is one suggestion for a password strategy, namely taking a random sentence and only using the beginning letters of each word. And there's an example here. It will show up on the screen in a moment, I guess, but I guess you know the strategy. Well, the strategy is, in my opinion, certainly better than picking just a word or so, because if you pick the first letter of each word in a longer sentence, there's a very high number of possible options for that. It's not exactly as good as really picking each letter uniformly at random. This is because in any sentence, some letters are more likely than others. So many words, for example, will start with an E, and almost no words in the sentence will start with an X or something like that. So to estimate the entropy of this strategy, you could, for example, look at the distribution of letters in the English language, if it's an English sentence, and then multiply this entropy of one randomly drawn letter with the length of the word. It's still only an approximation, but it's a reasonably good one. So this is the strategy that's easier to evaluate than picking a word, and it's, yeah, I personally find it relatively easy to remember as well. So this could be a good strategy. What else do we have here? What does the box above the letter stand for? Well, each box here represents one bit of entropy. So it doesn't say anything about the particular letter, but it says something about the choice we made at this point, like caps lock, yes or no. So entropy isn't really a great measurement, right? Because usually servers will obviously block when you're trying to brute force passwords or at least generate captchas. Very good point. Indeed, if you have an authentication service that has some additional mechanisms in place, like for example, rate limiting or blocking you after a certain number of bad tries, then indeed you're a lot more safe than suggested in this comic here, because you could never actually get to try all of these 2 to the 28 possible options, because you would be blocked long before that. So this is also why in some contexts we can use really short and weak passwords, like for example the 4-digit PIN of your banking card, because the bank simply blocks you after a few tries. Let's see. Your cat's name is correct or is battery stable. Okay. I guess I don't have much to add to that. There's a fan of passphrases compared to passwords here. So this strategy is very often referred to as passphrases, but some people also refer to the sentence construction as passphrases. So the terminology is not very clear here. Okay, what else do we have? Hide the presentation when showing questions. I really would like to, but I can't easily. So where I plan questions, I have an empty slide, but where I don't plan, I don't have an empty slide. So sorry for making it very hard to read all of these questions. Is there even a precise way to measure the entropy of a human selected password? Well, not really, because humans don't usually select their passwords by an easily measurable strategy. So if you just think of something, it's usually very hard to measure that. Is brute force still possible? So this is a question which also refers to protection mechanisms against this kind of weakness, namely rate limiting in the form of letting you wait longer the more often you try passwords. So for example, if you have 10 wrong passwords, you have to wait a minute. If you have 15, you already have to wait an hour between passwords and so on. So indeed, that's a very good countermeasure against an exhaustive number of tries. So that's good in a password context, but it's not so good in some other contexts. Like for example, if you have a password protected file or so, there is no way of preventing you from trying all the passwords out in parallel. There is no server who you're verifying against, but you're just locally trying to validate something. So there, this doesn't work. Somebody's suggesting a partnership with LastPass. Well, I'm personally not using it, so I guess no. Okay, I'll keep the quantum question for the end of the lecture. Okay, so let's have a look at the time. Okay, we're actually pretty much in time as planned. Let's have a look at how to improve this password process. One way how we can improve it is one you might already have heard about, namely to use a hash function together with it. More specifically, a password hashing function. So what is the idea here? I assume we have a magic hashing function which we can plug the key into and then encode it into some fingerprint of the key. So this is what servers indeed do, hopefully, when they are in charge of protecting long lists of passwords. They don't save the password in plain text, but they hash it first. We will get later in this lecture to what this actually means in detail. But the idea is that an attacker who gets this list only gets the hash of the password, and the hashing function is a one-way function. So it's not possible to get back from the output, from the hash value, to the input value, so the password. That's the idea. So that's a great idea because now we've somewhat mitigated one of the risks we saw earlier, namely that the list of stored passwords could leak. However, a couple of problems still remain in this. One of the things is that we still have this problem that we are actually just transmitting the password. Notice that if we use a password hashing function, it's not Alice who hashes and sends the hash, but it's Bob who hashes. And this actually makes sense because hashing, so if Alice would hash the password and send the hash, this would actually not protect against anything because an eavesdropper could still just intercept the hash password and send it to Bob next time. They wouldn't even need to know what the original password was. Storing it in a hashed way is a bit better, but there are still issues. Namely, that people are really, really bad at choosing passwords. So very often this list will include some well-known passwords. For example, some passwords from the list of 1 million most popular passwords. And if an attacker already has this list of 100 most or 1 million most popular passwords and the corresponding hash values, they could simply compare the list of hash values to this table, and they would at least be able to pick out or see all the weak values. Or they could see, for example, if two users have exactly the same password, because they would also have the same hash value. So there are still some remaining issues here. And for this reason, when using password hashing functions, you usually don't just hash the password itself, but additionally a so-called salt. A salt is just an additional randomizing value, so a short random string, which is hashed together with the password. And the goal of that is to make it harder for an attacker to find weak passwords in the table. Because instead of just looking at all the hashed passwords, they would now have to try each of the 1 million most popular passwords for each possible user and hash each of them together with the salt. So for each user, they would actually have the workload of hashing 1 million passwords instead of just looking at the hash value. So that's a lot more effort. So that's why this is a good idea. This is called a salt. There's also the concept of a pepper, which is like a secret salt. So a pepper is essentially a key of the server that is additionally put in. That's also a great idea. Okay, so this is a reasonable way if you really want to use only passwords. However, there are a number of great alternatives. And in particular, all of the mechanisms we've seen so far fall in the category of so-called weak authentication schemes. Even if you have super strong passwords, even if you use password hashing functions with salts and peppers, this is still called weak authentication. And the reason is because you send the secret. This is the core property of weak authentication. And there is an alternative, the so-called strong authentication or challenge response protocols. And what they try to do is they try to prevent you from having to send your password. If you log into a website, I just want to mention that this is usually protected because this is not actually an untrusted channel, but you first set up a trusted channel like an HTTPS connection, and only then you send your password. So your password is protected because you've done some crypto beforehand. This is the final note. But let's get back to strong authentication. The idea here is that we don't ask the user to transmit the complete secret. They just prove that they know the secret. And how is this be done? How can this be done? You prove it by answering so-called challenges. So if the server wants you to prove who you are, they send you a challenge. This could, for example, be a current timestamp or a value that they generated, and you send back a response which belongs to this challenge. Let's see an example of how this can look like. And this example is time-based one-time passwords, TOTP. That's a particular protocol that you might already be using if you're using two-step authentication for one of many online services. So last time this included Google, GitHub, many banking websites, and so on. So the process here is you first provide your password on the website directly, and then you provide a one-time password. And this one-time password is actually a response to a challenge. You didn't actually see the challenge because the challenge is usually the current time. And the answer to this challenge is that you compute a function of the challenge, namely a function which depends on your secret. So in the original TOTP, this function that we compute is a message authentication code, which we'll meet later in the lecture. And this is a keyed function. So you compute a function of your password or a secret stored on your phone and the current timestamp. And you send this to the server. And this is a one-time password because it's only valid at this very time, around this timestamp, where the timestamp is relatively coarse. So for example, it can be in 30-second steps. This would mean that there's a validity period of 30 seconds to your one-time password. This is in order to be more robust if the clocks are not completely synchronized. This key that you have is some sort of pre-shared key. So this is usually exchanged in a sort of setup phase where you link your device with a website. At that time you exchange your shared secrets, so the key, and later you always compute a function of the key. Alice can do it because she has stored the key on her phone, and the server can compute exactly the same function because they've also stored Alice's secret. And so, to verify, the server computes exactly the same function using the same secret and using the current timestamp, and if the two values match, then the Alice's attempt is accepted. And this is, for example, what's computed in many of these apps where you have these codes with a short validity period which change every few seconds or so. Okay, so that's one example of strong authentication. There are many other ways how to do it in different contexts, for example using asymmetric cryptography, but the principle is always the same. There is a sort of challenge which guarantees a short validity of the login, and the prover computes a function of this challenge and the secret. Okay, so let's summarize the first part before we go into the break, and for that we can first look at the questions, and then I have a final question for the break. So let's see. The first question is referring to the usage of salts, and it's asking whether the salt is chosen at random for each entry or if it's the same for every user. Good point, sorry if I was not clear about that. This is indeed chosen randomly for each user separately. So each user has their own salt, because the main point of the salt is that you cannot attack all users at the same time, but you have to target each user individually. And for each user with their own salt, try all the password candidates, for example, that you want to test. Which password manager I personally use? I use KeePassX, but I don't want to advertise it because I didn't do an in-depth study of all available password managers. There are a couple of good ones out there, and there are a couple of horrible ones out there. So it's best to do an up-to-date research in case you're looking for a new password manager. Do you think that cascading different hash functions is necessary? For all the people who didn't ask the question, cascading hash functions is a mechanism. If you don't trust a particular hash function, then you, to be safe, execute, for example, 2 hash functions. And then as long as at least one of the 2 is secure, your output is secure. I don't think it's necessary because I have a great amount of trust in the 2 currently standardized modern hash functions, SHA-2 and SHA-3. So I wouldn't cascade anything for that. This is more a cumbersome way to deal with outdated and slightly insecure or untrusted hash functions, which you shouldn't be using in the first place. Why is there support Überweisung? Trust me, I really don't get the security concept. I've been wondering the same thing, and I never want to use them because it's just so counterintuitive to have to enter your credentials on the wrong website. It's just wrong. I personally don't like it, but again, I didn't do an in-depth security assessment, so I don't want to judge too loudly. Challenge response. The strength is basically the length of the response, right? At least if the function on the secret is assumed to be evenly distributed. Very good catch. Yes, indeed. The length of the response determines the level of security. You will notice that the responses that you have to send are often really, really short. So for example, when you log into your banking website, depending on the vendor, it might be something like a 4-letter password using only uppercase characters and numbers. So that's very few possible options. The reason why it's still reasonably secure is that first, it's only the second factor. You already need the password to be able to target it in the first place. And second, you essentially only have 1 try, or maybe 3 tries or so. If you get it wrong, the server immediately will block you, and you might have, for example, to talk to your banking provider or something like that. So these systems where you have these very short challenge response answers are usually additionally protected with mechanisms against brute forcing. This is why they are reasonably short to keep them reasonably user-friendly. How does the server know which salt has been used for which user? They need to store it together with the user. So the password table now includes 3 entries for each user: the username, the salt, and the salted hashed password. Can you give a concrete example of a salt? Yes, it can, for example, be a 64-bit string, a random 64-bit string where each bit is chosen uniformly at random would be an example of a salt. So it's no magic number or so, it's just some additional entropy to make the output of the hash value more uniformly distributed than it would be if we would just put the password in. So the actual password is transmitted over an insecure channel. Well, in this explanation on the slides, yes. In reality, please no. Please always ensure that you're on a secure channel before you send a password somewhere. And the typical way how you can ensure this is by checking that you're on an HTTPS connection. Because here, all the messages are sent in an encrypted way, including your passwords. So from observing the encrypted ciphertext, the attacker cannot recover your password. It would need to be intercepted at one of the two endpoints. So when you enter it, for example, if you have a keylogger on your computer or phone, or on the server's end in case there is, for example, a malicious task running there. Okay. Are you generally in favor of password managers? Yes, absolutely. Because I really don't know how you would otherwise be able to manage the huge amount of passwords that you really need if you want to be safe on a computer or in the internet. Because reusing passwords is a horrible idea. Using an easy pattern for passwords is a horrible idea. For example, if you have a super strong short password and then you just append the name of the website to each website where you go. For example, let's assume test123 is a secure password and your password for Google is test123 Google, and for the next service it's test123-standard and then test123 Microsoft or something. Then as soon as an attacker has recovered one of them, they will probably get your pattern and they can easily apply it to all the other ones. Similarly, if you store all of them on paper, this might be good as long as nobody breaks into your home or nobody in your home wants to access your computer. But it's a very non-user-friendly way of managing things. So having lots of random different passwords for different websites is, in my opinion, an absolute must. And I don't know many reasonable ways of managing that without technical help. And technical help can, for example, be a password manager. It can also be a device where you store things, so that's also a good alternative. For example, using second factors and so on. But I personally wouldn't know how to handle life without a password manager. If you do use a password manager, be sure it's one that you can protect with a password, so a master password, and that doesn't, for example, get unlocked automatically whenever you unlock your computer. So some of the ways of managing passwords do that, unfortunately. Okay, what makes the HTTPS protocol so trusted? That's a good question. I need 3 more lectures to explain that to you. So in the very last crypto lecture, we'll get to the HTTPS protocol. And we will see that it uses all the crypto that we looked at. Hash functions, MACs, encryption, signatures, you have it. Why does it have to be a 64-bit string and not a 64-bit number? Is it because of the hash function? So I guess this is referring back to my answer to the salt question. Yes, it's going to be encoded as a bit string whenever it's input into a hash function. So hash functions are generally defined to work on inputs that are bit strings. So whatever we put into a hash function, we need to convert it to that format first. However, if you're looking at a 64-bit number on your computer, it is already a bit string. It is, for example, an int, and an int is nothing other than a bit string. So I always say bit string because that's the sort of abstract mathematical way of talking about it. But anything that is already stored on your computer is already a bit string, no matter whether you call it a char pointer or an int or whatever. So even if you hash a password, you need to encode the password in a way. It's usually already in ASCII, so that would be the way to go. Is the Google Chrome integrated password manager good enough in your opinion? I have to repeat what I said earlier. I didn't do an in-depth security analysis of it. There are a lot of great people working in security at Google, so I guess it's a reasonable trade-off, but it might not satisfy all your needs. So in particular, if I'm not mistaken, you can choose to use this password manager without a master password. I'm not sure if this is still up to date. If you ask whether it's good enough, it's also the question, which sort of passwords do you store in there? So for example, if you have some very powerful passwords that protect a big part of your personal life, like for example, a Google account where you have all your data backup and all your stuff, then you might want to take more care with that than with some less meaningful and hopefully different passwords. So for example, I do save some passwords in my browser, but not the really important ones. What else do we have? A phone call, we can ignore that for the moment. How secure is it to store passwords in the browser? I guess that's the same as the previous question. If you're really worried about the security of some services, it's better to do some research. In particular, if you watch this video 2 years from now, the recommendation about which password manager is good or so might already be totally different. Firefox and Google Chrome have also changed their password management system quite significantly in the last years. What if you forget the password to the password manager? Well, then you're pretty screwed typically, assuming that some of the services there don't have an easy recovery way. Thankfully, most services do have a way to recover your passwords. But yeah, please be sure not to lose it. That holds for a lot of crypto. You can protect stuff really well, but you can already also really screw it up if you forget your key, because then there's usually no way around it. You hopefully can't crack your password database, for example. So you might want to take some additional precautions to make sure you don't lose this password. For example, storing it on paper in a trusted place that nobody else finds or something like that. Okay, and then finally we have the quantum question, which disappeared for the moment. I think the site is currently hanging. So let's refresh, or let's answer the question that I do see here and hope that the app recovers. So SteamGuard uses TOTP. Sorry, I don't know. I'm not using SteamGuard, so I don't know. Then we have one more question here. If the individual salt is also stored in the table, the hacker can see it. How is it more secure? Yes, indeed, the attacker can see it, but the point is, if the attacker has one guess for the password, then salts don't make it much more secure. So it's still easy for the attacker to verify whether the stored password is the particular candidate password that the attacker has in mind. However, if the attacker has 1 million candidate passwords in mind and there are 10 million users in the database, then the attacker has to target each individual user with each individual password candidate. So they would need to do a total of approximately 10 million times 1 million hashing evaluations, because each user has a different salt, and that becomes infeasible. So targeting a large class of users becomes more difficult with the salt. It doesn't so much protect one individual user. So if the attacker has one particular target and already a good idea of their password strategy, then it doesn't help a lot. But if it's for protecting large databases, and most horrible password leaks were covering large databases, then the salt helps. What do I think about Sphinx and DPake? I think that's too advanced for this course. Are there services you personally don't use because you don't trust their security or because you have doubts about their privacy policies? Yeah, well, if I would not use all the websites whose privacy policy I mistrust, then I wouldn't have much to do. But there are there are means of working with such services. For example, by offering them less from your side. If you don't trust the site's privacy policies, don't give them any data. Use for example, privacy-friendly settings or privacy-friendly browser variants on your phone. If you don't trust a website in how it handles the passwords. Please don't give them any of your strong passwords, but choose a separate one that you don't use anywhere else. Things like that. So if you don't trust something, treat it like that. It doesn't mean you can't use it at all, but use it with care. That's why you use salt and pepper. That's a good answer to one of the previous questions, namely the salt is public, but the pepper is not. So when you use the pepper, you're essentially additionally encrypting your entire database. Did you invent a crypto algorithm? We call it usually design, but yes, I did design a few crypto algorithms, and one of them is called ASCOM. Somebody mentioned it in the first lecture, which we're currently hoping to get standardized, but we'll know more about that next year. Okay, thanks for a lot of questions. It's high time that we go into a break. Let's do, let's say, a 10-minute break. So we'll continue 1 minute before 11. And to entertain you during the break, I have a question for you, namely, what do you think about these different authentication factors? Which of them do you rate as more strongly than the others? So sort them from strongest to weakest. You have some time for that, 10 minutes approximately. Maybe you want to do some computations. Okay, so see you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back from the break. I hope you had a nice coffee or something other that woke you up again. So we have some results for the question I asked before the break. And before we look at which of them is actually the strongest, let's analyze it using this entropy method that we've seen so far. So let's first have a look at the first ranked option here. So it says USB token with a 128-bit key. Let's for the moment only focus on the entropy of the actual secret that is stored. So what's the entropy of this? This is actually the example we've already seen before. 128-bit value, which is hopefully chosen independently and uniformly at random, would have an entropy of 128 bits. So let's note that down. We have a total of 2 to the 128 options. So the entropy is 128 bits. I'm sorry this is a bit hard to read, but the pen is running a bit out of stuff. Okay, let's ignore the fingerprint for now and let's have a look at the third one. So here it says a password of 6 alphanumeric digits. How many possible choices do we have for that? Let's assume for the moment that we are talking about uppercase and lowercase letters plus numbers. So for the numbers, we have a total of 10 options, plus we have a total of, let's take an English keyword, 26 lowercase letters and 26 uppercase letters. So that's a total of 62 if I'm not mistaken. That's per letter, and we have a total of 6 letters, so the total number of options is this to the power of 6. Sorry, this is really hard to read. But how much is that? If we plug it into a calculator, or if I have a look at my cheat sheet, then this is approximately 2 to the power of 36, which is absolutely unlegible, but I hope you trust me on that. So 2 to the power of 36 possible options. Assuming that each of them is equally likely, this would be 36 bits of entropy. Now for the very last option, the pin of 12 numeric digits. How many options do we have here? Well, it's an unreadable 10 per letter, and we have a total of 12 letters, so 10 to the power of 12, which I need to check my cheat sheet, is approximately, let's see, 2 to the power of 40. So that's 40 bits of entropy, assuming that all of the pins are equally likely. So in total for the first one, we have 128 bits. Here we have 36 bits, and here we have 40 bits of entropy. So this means that the last two of them should actually be switched. At least in terms of entropy, the pin with the longer length and fewer options per digit actually turns out to be a tiny bit better than the password, which has more options per letter, but a very short length overall. And against the brute force attacker, both of them are a bit too weak if the user is targeted directly, because 2 to the 40 or so is still feasible, even if it's a hashing function. Borderline, but feasible. And finally, the fingerprint. Now it gets interesting, because for the fingerprint, we can't actually really measure the entropy. And in fact, there are a lot of things we can't measure about it. And this is because in biometrics, classically, there is a lot of closed source stuff going on, which is not publicly available. So the exact quality of a fingerprint sensor and so on is different to evaluate. There are some metrics that you can use, like for example, what is the probability that a wrong fingerprint is accepted versus what is the probability that a fingerprint of the correct owner is not accepted. These are two very important factors, one for security, the second one for usability. And these you can quantify, but otherwise it's very difficult to evaluate. So for this reason, it's hard to compare with any of the options on this scale here. However, it's a really convenient way how to get it to your phone. That's the given. So we have an unhappy cat here who wants to leave, who's not very fond of passwords and almost invisible. but let's together have a look at the questions that we got in the meantime. So let's check. Let's go to white slide and the questions. We already had this one. Once the fingerprint is leaked, the verification method is burned for you. That's absolutely one of the big downsides of fingerprints. You cannot change them, and in particular, you actually leave them all around in the public. So if somebody really targets you, they might just grab glass you used previously in a restaurant or something and take your fingerprint off that. So that's one of the very big downsides. In cryptography, we always make sure to use very easily exchangeable secrets. Problem with fingerprints is, yes, it cannot be undone anymore. Absolutely, I totally agree on that one. There's somebody who has an answer for the SteamGuard question, saying that they assume it uses TOTP because every time you log in, you acquire a code via email. Well, if you actually get the code via email, that means it's not derived from a secret stored on your device. So it might use a slightly different mechanisms, but it surely is an example of one-time passwords. Let's put away the board here so that I don't have to clean it immediately. Blah, blah, blah. Is a user ID like blah, blah, blah secure to use as an API key? Well, that depends on a lot of circumstances. Generally, we usually recommend that the secret shouldn't be in the user ID, but in a separate value. So that's already something that would be problematic here. In terms of the choice of letters and the length, it's a bit unclear. It doesn't look to be an alphanumeric value. It rather looks like these are actually hex values because they're just going from 0 to 9 and A to F. So this means if you want to evaluate the entropy of this, you'd have to count that each of the letters contributes 4 bits, or every pair contributes 8 bits. Then you get an estimate for the entropy of this thing. But how secure it is as an API key really depends on a lot of the other mechanisms used. What are the biological factors that determine a person's fingerprint? I really don't know. I'm not a biologist, so I can't give you any details on that. There's also more involved than just the fingerprint itself, because there's a lot of variation of what you can do when you measure the fingerprint, which properties you actually take into account to make it easy to verify and match. So I'm not an expert on that. More information on SteamGuard, saying you can also use it works like the same as Google Authentication inside the Steam app. There it might use the same TOTP protocol, but it's best to just Google it if you want to know more details. A showcase of Hexe for more motivation, I would really love to, but she's sleeping right over there in her little spot, and I don't want to wake her. Okay, that's that for questions. Now let's come to the actual crypto algorithms. Okay. Somebody's writing something about sound problems in the chat. If it persists, please give me more details via the questions here. Okay, it seemed I lost focus of the slides. There we go. Okay, so hash functions. We already heard that they're an ingredient in password-based schemes, but they actually can do a lot more. In summary, they are a keyless authentication scheme. Let's have a look at the mathematical definition of a hash function. So what's a hash function? It's a function that maps an input message, which we call M, and which takes the form of a bit string, into a tag. And the important thing is that the message can be arbitrarily long, so as long as you like, but the tag will always have a fixed size. It will always have T bits. And this version or this tag can serve as a fingerprint or as a checksum for the message. So if we want to write this in mathematics, we write it as follows. So we have a function which we call calligraphic H, and it maps from bit strings of arbitrary length to bit strings of t bits. So this notation here, this F2, is how cryptographers like to talk about bit strings. You can read this F2 as a finite field of size 2, but that's just a fancy way of saying bits. So here it says bits arbitrarily many, and here it says bits t of them. And we call the input of the hash function m, and the output, for example, t, or some people also call it h. So this must be a function that compresses things, because it can take very long inputs and always produces short outputs. But the great thing is that we can use this tag in place of the message m, for example, if we want to protect the authenticity of the message. So as an example of how to use this, let's assume we have again Alice talking to Bob. We again have our Eve who's watching an untrusted channel or manipulating it. And if now Alice wants to send a message to Bob and to be sure that it wasn't changed on the way, then what Alice can do is the following. She takes the message she wants to send, hashes it to get a hashtag, then she sends the message over the normal untrusted channel, and in some way she conveys the tag over a secure channel to Bob. I'll give you a few examples in a moment. What does Bob do when he receives the two things? Well, he takes the message, puts it into exactly the same hash function, also gets a tag as a result, and then compares this tag to the one he received from Alice. And if the two match, so if the two outputs of the hash function are the same, then Bob can conclude that the inputs must also have been the same, or in other words, the message was not modified in transit, because the one he received is the same as the one that was sent. So what are examples of how you can transmit something over a secure channel? And why wouldn't you send the message over the secure channel in the first place? Well, we already saw one example for that earlier when we talked about the Linux image. So it might be that the message is too large to be comfortably transmitted over the secure channel, like an HTTPS connected website. But it might be transmittable over some other way, like a torrent. But you can publish the hashtag on the secure website. That's one option. Another option is that you might additionally use a signature scheme, and you could protect this tag with the signature. There are a lot of other examples. For example, when you're just using the tag as a placeholder for the message, and use this property that if the tag is the same, the message is also with overwhelming probability the same. You can, for example, use this as a placeholder for some history that has occurred. For example, if you hash a big process and at a later point you want to add something to the history, then you can simply combine the new stuff with this placeholder and get a new placeholder, something like that. Okay, so that's how to use a hash function generally. There are a lot of individual examples that are slightly different. Now, how can we measure that a hash function is secure? There are three very, very important classical security properties for hash functions. And I've listed them here. The first one of them is the so-called pre-image resistance. That means if a tag is given, for example, it has been sent over a secure channel, then for anybody else, it must be infeasible, which means not practically possible, for the attacker to find any message that produces this hashtag or this value. So if you are given the output, it's impossible to find a suitable input. And this property must hold even in this variant called second pre-image resistance, where you're not only given the tag, the hash value, but you're already given one valid solution. So one message that hashes to exactly this tag. Even in that case, it must be infeasible for you to find any second message, M prime, that produces the same output as the one you've received. Okay, if an attacker would be trying to solve this by brute force, how could they do that? In the first case, they could simply, so they know this tag they want to reach, they don't know the message. They can simply try random messages of any length, plug them into the hash function, and see whether by chance, because we're lucky, we get exactly the right hashtag. Now this is possible, but it's typically very expensive. So remember that the tag is t bits long, so there are 2 to the power of t possible values for it. This means if we try to brute force it, we will need an average of approximately 2 to the t, well, divided by 2, but let's say 2 to the t approximately trials. Usually after trying about half of them, we can expect to be finished, but let's keep it simple. In the case of the second pre-match resistance, we actually have only this same strategy. So we've given m and the hash value t, and what we can do is we can simply try any other messages m prime until we get the right output. Notice here that we are phrasing this only as the security of the output, so depending on the output, but this of course assumes that the challenge message, so in this case, for example, the actual message that produced the tag must have been chosen uniformly at random. So this assumes that guessing or accidentally hitting the right tag is easier than accidentally hitting the right message, because there are infinitely many possible messages. This only holds if there isn't a particular pattern to how the original message was chosen. So for example, assume that your message is a password and you're given the password hash. If the password is weak, you can of course break this a lot faster than in 2 to the t tries, because you might also succeed because you have some knowledge of the message, or you guess a strategy how the message was chosen, and it's a very poor strategy. For example, if the message is on the list of 1 million possible or most popular passwords, then you won't need 2 to the t trials, whatever t is, you'll just need approximately 1 million or 500,000. But in cryptography, we always assume that the challenge was chosen in a hard way, so we always talk about the probability in terms of the output. Now notice that these two security properties are both properties that protect against a malicious person on the channel or on the receiving end. So either Bob or Eve would be interested in finding such a second pre-image or pre-image. There is a third property which is very, very important and can be a bit counterintuitive to understand. And this is called collision resistance. And it says that an attacker must find it infeasible to find any two different messages producing the same hash. Notice that there's a very important difference to the second pre-image resistance. In the second pre-image resistance, one of the two messages is already fixed and the corresponding output is fixed. And you need to find a second message which collides with exactly this output value. Whereas in case of the collision resistance, you're completely free to choose both of the messages. You're only interested in that the two have the same output. Which output is not relevant for you. And the thing is that this turns out to be a lot easier than this. So in particular, if you try to brute force this, you will only need about 2 to the power of t divided by 2 trials. So in other words, if you measure it in bits of security, this has t-bit security, this only has t-half-bit security. I'll get to that in a moment. I see somebody is issuing a lot of question marks. Unfortunately, I'm not sure exactly which part you're confused about. So it might be best if you drop a precise message in the question channel. But for now, let's have a look at where this 2 to the power of t divided by 2 comes from. And the reason for this is the so-called birthday paradox. So the birthday paradox takes its name from the following observation. assume you're in a classroom of only 23 people, so a typical KU group or class in school. Then there's actually a really good probability, about 50%, that 2 of these people have the same birthday. Even though there are 366 possible birthdays, even in such a small group, likely 2 of them are going to have the same birthday. So their birthdays are going to collide. How can we explain approximately why this is the case? Let's have a look at the collision resistance of hash functions again. So assume the attacker tries to brute force this thing, and what they do is the following. They generate approximately 2 to the power of t divided by 2 different messages and hash them. So they collect a large list of hash values, namely so many of them. This is, by the way, the same as the square root of 2 divided by t. So now we have so many candidate tags. Now, how many possible combinations of 2 of them do we have which could collide? Well, I have 2 to the t divided by 2 options, and any 2 of them, I can pick any 2 of them, they have a chance to collide. So I have 2 to the t over 2, choose 2 many options. In German you would say 2 hoch t halbe über 2. So that's a binomial coefficient. If you write that out, this is approximately the same as the top value squared divided by 2, which in turn is the same as approximately 1/2 times 2 to the power of t candidate pairs. So you might know this effect maybe from when you're cheering on some great event and you're having some champagne and you're trying to hit glasses with everyone. Now, if every person hits glasses with every other person, you have approximately n squared divided by 2 many blings. And each of these blings is a chance for our 2 values here to collide. So if we have only 2 to the t divided by 2 candidates, we have approximately 2 to the t possible pairs of candidates. Each of the pairs collides with a probability of 1 divided by 2 to the t, because when we look at the first message in first tag in a pair, it has a particular value. The second has 1 out of 2 to the t values. And if this one is exactly the same as the first one, then they collide. So this success probability per pair times this many pairs gives us approximately a success probability of approximately 1/2. Can be a bit above that as well. And from that point on, it rises really fast. So if you take only a tiny bit more, you already have a success probability of 90% or something like that. So for example, here with 23 people, you have 50%. With, I don't know, 25, 26 or 27, you already have a really, really high success probability. Okay, so the main takeaway message here is the birthday paradox works because if you have k candidates, then you have approximately k squared combinations of candidates which could collide. Okay, let's have a look at how large these numbers should actually be in case we want to achieve something. I see there are a couple questions, so let's look at that. I'm again sorry that I have to show them over the slide. So one question is, somebody is confused because the first question about what can be sent over an unsecured channel, blah, blah. So hashes can be sent over unsecured channels. No. Well, they can be, but the thing is, if somebody sends the message and the hash over the same unsecured channel, then somebody could manipulate the message and also manipulate the tag. Because in an unsecured channel, the attacker is assumed to be able to write anything or manipulate anything. So they could simply write a new message, and because the hash function is public, they could also compute the correct hash for this message and simply send it along. So for example, if somebody wanted to get a manipulated Linux image to you, and assuming that the hash would also be distributed over the torrent, for example, they could manipulate the Linux image, compute the hash of the new Linux image, and send that along over the same insecure channel. And locally, the result would match because the new manipulated tag fits the new manipulated data, and you wouldn't notice that anything had gone wrong. So for this reason, you must prevent an attacker from manipulating the stored or transmitted hash values. So we say that they should be transmitted over a secure channel, typically. So this is to protect against manipulation. If you're talking about confidentiality, then the hash typically doesn't give you a lot of information about the message, unless you already have a few candidate guesses that you can easily verify them. So this is probably referring back to the quiz as well, where I said that only the ciphertext should be transmitted over an insecure channel, and this is still true, so the hashes shouldn't be. The second question is this is just for validation of an unchanged message, right? Because Eve has complete access to M. Yes, exactly. So this is only to protect against the authenticity, but not the confidentiality, because M is simply transmitted in the plane. Correct. Okay. I see some more silly questions, which we'll remove. No, I don't have a new cat. I've had them both for many years. Can I explain the cat, the tag again? The tag is the output of the hash function. So you plug a very long message, for example, the Linux image, into the hash function, and you get a short string as an output. Typically, this will be, for example, a 250-bit string. So if you think back to the beginning of the lecture where I showed the example with the Linux image, there you saw an example of the tag. So it was simply a long bit string written in hexadecimal. And the point of the tag is that it can be that two messages with an identical tag are likely also identical. So you can use this tag as a sort of fingerprint or checksum of the message. What do I mean by checksum? I mean, if the message is changed, the tag would also need to change, and otherwise it's not valid anymore. And by fingerprint, I mean that you can use the tag as a placeholder for the message, because you can later match the two again exactly, because if you simply hash the message again, you get the same tag. Okay, so you need at least 367 people in the room to be 100% sure. Yes, absolutely. So to reach 100%, you need really many people. But if you want only 99%, you can take a lot fewer. If you want only 90%, something like 30 or so is probably already sufficient. I don't have the exact numbers, but something like that. Okay. So in cryptography, we don't necessarily always need 100% guarantee to find something. If the attacker has a 50% chance, for example, of getting your password, that's already pretty bad, but because that means 1 out of 2 users will be affected. So the attacker doesn't need 100% guarantee, they just need a very decent probability. So what if Eve is eavesdropping on the message? Is the message encrypted now or not? In the example I showed earlier, it was not encrypted, so it was sent in the plane. So currently we're talking only about protecting authenticity. We'll get to protecting the confidentiality next week. Why can't you send everything over a secure channel? Well, very often you can. If you can, that's great, but sometimes you can't. For example, an HTTPS connection is not the right protocol to transmit a 7 GB Linux image, for example. You would want to use a different protocol. You don't want to put all the load on one server, but for example, use a peer-to-peer system and so on. So very often it's not convenient to send everything over a secure channel. Talking about the Git history, sending everything over a secure channel would mean rehashing all variants of all files for each new commit. Then each new commit would take ages and also take up a lot of disk space probably. So how would one build the secure channel in the first place? One way is to predict it with some crypto protocol or algorithm that we're covering in the next lectures, like for example a signature scheme or HTTPS connection. Another way is because, for example, you assume that you occasionally meet your communication partner. That would be considered a secure channel, and then you don't meet for a month, and in the meantime you need to use some internet channel or so in the meantime. So this is a more historical example. Like we discussed in the first lecture, I think, well, this is going into too much detail because we don't have too much time left. But yeah, you can use other crypto to build a secure channel in the first place. And we'll get to that. Okay. So let's hurry along so that we can finish what was planned for today. One of the open questions that we take away from the previous slide is the question, so we're talking a lot about 2 to the t something or bits of entropy, but how many bits are actually enough? And here's a slide where I try to give a very, very rough intuition about this. Note that it depends on a number of factors, but let's first have a look at what I've written here. So there are actually different metrics where you can need 2 to the something tries. So attacking or brute forcing a key mainly takes time. So for example, brute forcing a password simply means you take each candidate password, you hash it and check the result. And that takes a certain time in cipher calls. So how much time is feasible? In classical crypto systems, like for example when you execute a fast hash function or a block cipher, then executing about something like 2 to the 32 of them is completely trivial. So in fast code, this is done within seconds. Something like 2 to the 48 is no longer trivial, so you might not want to do that on an everyday basis. But if you're really determined, you can still do it on your own. You simply need to wait, for example, for a few days or something, or use a bit more cores than just one. 2 to the 64, that's sort of borderline. So there are certainly people who have enough computational power and money and time to do this, but it's probably not you. So in particular, if you look at, for example, how many hashes are computed each day as part of the Bitcoin network, this is way above this 2 to the 64 threshold. But of course, that's an international effort, and you can't use this to crack your passwords or something like that. So you should assume that there are people who are capable of spending this much computation time in parallel, but it's not you. 2 to the 80, well, there might be people capable of doing that. I don't want to hedge any guesses, but I guess there are a few targets that would be worth spending this much time and electricity on. Here we're getting in the order of magnitudes that we are usually talking in cryptography. So for example, when encrypting things, we usually use 128-bit keys, which would give us approximately a time effort of 2 to the 128 for an attacker. And this is absolutely infeasible. And it's also not going to be feasible anytime in the near future. Similar for 2 to the 256, absolutely out of the reach. Things look a bit different if we are talking not about fast crypto schemes, but about crypto schemes which are intentionally slow. So in particular, password hashing is such a case. Password hashing functions are intentionally slow to make sure that even 2 to the 32 is a real effort. And this is done by simply making each individual computation so expensive, like taking half a second, for example, that 2 to the 32 of them already takes too long. There are also other things that cost a lot and that are harder to get than computation time. One of them is memory. So 2 to the 32 cipher states, for example, in memory, like you would use, for example, in the collision attack that I mentioned earlier, is still relatively feasible. You probably have this amount of RAM in your computer. So it might not be practical to spend all of it for a particular task, but it's feasible. I also think that there are people who have 2 to the 48, but I don't see 2 to the 64 memory available to anyone at the moment. 2 to the 80, I would say that's infeasible. Data is even harder to judge. So what do I mean by data, and how is it different from memory? By data, I mean data that somebody else has prepared for you. So in encryption, for example, we often talk about an attacker who has access to a certain amount of known ciphertexts with corresponding known plaintexts. And getting those is a lot harder because it's not you who are spending the computational power, it's somebody else, and you need to get them to spend this much. So here it totally depends on the application and what you're trying to do, how much you can feasibly get. So for example, if you're targeting a disk encryption scheme, then getting something like 2 to the 32 ciphertext for the same key might still be quite practical because that probably the hard disk is larger than that. If you're talking about messages in transit, it might be more difficult. So this one is really here a table that's difficult to judge. Okay, one more question before we go on. If it shows up, let's see. My phone doesn't know about it yet, so we'll have to wait until it arrives here, I guess. Okay, let's have a look at what this means for security levels. So we very often talk about security levels in bits of security, and this is very closely related to the entropy question we've been talking about before, because the entropy essentially tells us how random something is, which implicitly also means how often I have to try until I get the right one, for example, the right key or the right password. And this is why we use this n-bit security to mean an attacker would need approximately 2 to the power of n computations if they were to brute force this thing. And here 128-bit security is very widely seen as a very good choice. This is why when you choose an encryption scheme for something, you very often have the choice of something that's some 3-letter acronym -128. This usually means it has a 128-bit key, and that's a good choice. Anything larger is also fine. There are, however, schemes where you definitely need a bigger key or output size to reach 128-bit security. And one example is the one we saw just before, namely hash functions. We saw that due to the birthday paradox, you actually need a 256-bit output in order to achieve a 128-bit security level, which means an attacker needs 2 to the 128. So for hash functions, you usually have choices starting at blah 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 -256, and you shouldn't choose anything below that. There are also reasons why you might want a larger security level, and that is, for example, if you're worried about post-quantum security, because quantum computers can search for keys a bit faster, for symmetric keys, than regular computers. So for example, a quantum computer would reduce a 256-bit key very roughly to a 128-bit one. So this is a sort of precaution that you can take. It usually doesn't cost that much in efficiency, but don't be worried if you have this security level. You will sometimes see much higher numbers when you are able to choose algorithms, and that is particularly when we talk about a different class of algorithms, namely asymmetric ones. And we'll get to suitable key sizes for those in the third crypto lecture. But for now, remember 128-bit security, good choice. Okay, so this is where we want to get. The question is, how do we get there? And in particular, how do we build such a hash function? And there is one very important core strategy to this, and that is we want to process arbitrarily long messages. How do we do it? We always cut them into chunks and handle the chunks separately. And the function with which we handle the chunks are called primitives. So for example, we can encrypt something block by block, or we can compress something block by block. What do I mean by this in more detail? What do I mean by compressing? I mean a so-called compression function. And this is the core building block that we have inside hash functions. So a compression function is a function which takes an input that is larger than its output, namely it consists of a t-bit state input plus an m-bit message block input. And it compresses these two together to an output that's also only t bits. So in other words, you have a state and you update this state using an m-bit message, and afterwards you have a state of the same size. And the size is going to determine the security level of our hash function. Now, how do we use this building block to hash a message of arbitrary length? One that is not exactly m bits, which is some fixed number, but arbitrarily long. So to give you some numbers for practical examples, in the case of SHA-2, for example, which you will find used everywhere. It's certainly used in your HTTPS connection, it's used in Bitcoin, it's used in most places where we have a hash function. There, this t is usually 256 bits because of the birthday paradox. So the input state here is also 256 bits. And the message block, that's actually larger. In case of SHA-2, of the main SHA-2 version, it's 512 bits large. The main purpose of that is to have a higher performance. So larger message blocks means you can absorb the message faster. How can we use this now to actually hash a large message? So it's important to keep this distinction. A compression function takes a fixed size input and produces a fixed size output, and it's the building block of a hash function which takes an input of arbitrary length and also hashes it to a fixed output length. And to build this hash function from the compression function, we can use something called the Merkle-Damgård hash construction. What does this construction do? It wants to hash a message that is arbitrarily long, has many blocks. And to do this, the Merkle-Damgård scheme does the following. It first initializes its internal state with some value. This could, for example, be 0 or any other constant. It's fixed in the standard specification which constant that is. And then it keeps updating the states by adding blocks of the message. So the message must be divided into blocks of the same size, exactly the size of the message input block of the compression function. And then the first block is absorbed, we get an intermediate state. The next block is absorbed into it, we get an intermediate state, and so on. And we continue doing this up to the last message block. And if you've absorbed the last message block, then we get a final output, and this output serves as the hash. And here you can already recognize the structure that I hinted at earlier, namely that we can absorb part of what we want to hash. We get an intermediate result of a fixed size, which could, for example, be an intermediate hash also in some blockchain style system or in a git commit style system. And then at a later point, if we want to add something, we do that and we get an updated new hash value. And this final state here serves as the authentication tag of the message. So this is the hash output. Now there are a few more details that we need to consider to make this secure. And one of the very important questions is, what do we do if the length of the message is not exactly a multiple of the block size? So what if we cannot actually split the message into chunks of the same correct size? We're going to have to do something, and this something is called padding. So a padding scheme is a way to pad a message of some length to the next suitable length that we want. The length that we want is a multiple of the block size. For example, I mentioned earlier the 512-bit block size. And to get there, we need to append something to the message. And in case of the Merkle-Damgård scheme, we actually append two parts. The first part, the last part, but the first that I explained, is that we write down how long the message actually is. We write that down as a 64-bit integer because that's certainly a big enough number to save that. And additionally, so we add this at the very end of the message, and between the message and this length padding, we need a filler that can be of the right size that we need. So for example, if the message is just 1 bit long, we write down here a very long 1. So it's 00001. So in total we already have 64 bits plus 1 bit. And now we need to fill it up to 512 bits, for example, if that's the block size of the hash function. And to do this, we add as many zeros as we need, and very importantly, we add this block here. So this is a block which starts with a 1 bit and then has 7 0 bits. Why do we do that? Why don't we just fill it up with zeros? Well, there's a very important reason for that. If we would fill all of this up only with zeros, then we wouldn't know exactly where the message ended. Because it might be that the message is something that ends with zeros itself, which is totally valid. So we don't just have to encode strings, for example. It can be like any data at all. It can end with zeros. And if the message ends with zeros and the padding is also all zeros, then we wouldn't know exactly where the message ended. In case of Merkle-Damgård, we do have an additional helper to prevent this, and that's by writing down the exact bit length. So actually we're doubly secure here. Other hash functions use only one of these two methods. And one very important thing here is that this padding is always added. So not only if the length of the message is not right, but we need to add it always. Again, if we wouldn't do that, we wouldn't be able to decode this uniquely and to know exactly what the message looked like. Okay, so this is how to build a hash function. What do we do with it once we have one? I already mentioned the file download example as one very widely known example. It's also used often as an identifier for files. And in particular, it can, for example, be used to detect duplicate files. So for example, assume you're a cloud storage or something, you're storing tons of files, and maybe a user has actually several copies of the same file in different places. You could detect that if you hashed each file and look if any of two of the hashes were identical, because that would mean that the underlying files were also identical. So this can be used, for example, for deduplication, so then storing only one copy of the message and in the other place saying, oh, that's the same file as that one. It can also be used to find particular files that you're looking for, so the sort of indexing. For example, if you're a virus scanner or something, you might have hashes of particular evil files that you're looking for. Instead of storing the full files, you just store the hashes. It's also used in blockchains. It's using for passwords, but I want to add a comment on that in a moment, because we're not using the same crypto for passwords as in other hashing applications. I'll get to that. And finally, another thing that you can do is, because the hash function is difficult to invert. If you know the output, you cannot tell the input from it. You can only guess inputs and validate. If you have something like a commitment, a secret that you only want to show at a later point, like for example, you're trying to predict the future, but you only want to reveal your prediction after some time. One thing you can do is you can hash it, publish the hash right now. If the message has sufficiently low entropy, people won't be able to guess the message. And at a later point, you can show, tada, here's the message. You can verify that it hashes to the hash I already published earlier. So some people, for example, use this on Twitter to announce something in advance or so. So these are application examples. Which schemes are we actually using there? I've prepared a file here of the most widely used hash functions. You will notice that their names are rather easy to remember, because the most widely used ones are simply called SHA-1, 2, and 3. And there are some very old schemes which are called MD4 and MD5. These are completely broken. Please don't use them anywhere. SHA-1 is also broken. Please don't use it anywhere unless you're really sure about it. There are still a couple valid applications of SHA-1. For example, it's used in Git, but cryptographically speaking, it's broken, which means weaknesses in the algorithm have been discovered. SHA-2 is the one you find most widely around in all applications, And it comes in several variants with different bit sizes, so different security levels. And all of them, except for the smallest one, is above 128-bit security. And for this reason, these are also the ones which are supported in the current TLS protocol. This is the protocol that runs inside HTTPS and which we're going to cover in this lecture. So here it supports these SHA-2 versions. There's also a SHA-3, which is also has been standardized for some time. It's unfortunately not yet supported in many places, but it's a great design. And one of the reasons why it's great is that, unlike the predecessors, it was actually found in a public competition. I don't want to go into the details right now here, but competitions are one of the most important ways how crypto standards are defined. So everybody can send candidate designs there. They are evaluated over many, many years. And then after many years of security and performance evaluation, one winner is chosen that's actually standardized. And SHA-3 is the output of such a competition, as is the AES, for example. And finally, a note on what not to confuse the hashing functions with. The first important thing is that password hashing functions are a bit different than normal hash functions. This is because normal hash functions are supposed to be fast, like if you use them in a file system, they should be fast. But if you use them for password hashing, you actually want them to be real slow, because you want an attacker who tries many of them to be as slow as possible. For this reason, there are specialized password hashing functions, like for example PBKDF2 or scrypt or bcrypt, which you should use instead of the SHA family. So SHA is not suitable for password hashing because it's too fast. Non-cryptographic hash function don't need to satisfy any of the security properties that we have here. And finally, something like error detecting codes are actually also something weaker than hash functions. So you often will find checksums like CRC32 somewhere. These only protect against accidental mistakes, not against an attacker. So for example, they are used on CDs to check the validity or the integrity of CDs and correct errors, but they are not suitable as soon as an attacker tries to manipulate something. So here's a list of popular password hashing functions, which are all nice to use. There is also a good website with material on a password hashing competition, if you find that interesting. And I would have planned a few more slides on message authentication codes, but we simply have to move that to next week. It's just a few slides. Let's jump ahead to the conclusion for today. So we looked a lot at message and entity authentication. For message authentication, we saw that it can be done without a key that we covered today. In the next weeks, we are going to look at how to do it with a symmetric or an asymmetric key. We also talked about entity authentication, so weak and strong authentication, and saw that these here are useful building blocks for these protocols. Let's have a final quick look at questions in case they arrived at my phone. Well, unfortunately, they have actually. Somebody's complaining about their colleagues and them writing mean questions and even upvoting them. Thanks a lot for that. I see that this question has received a lot of support. Why do you use 256-bit keys? Well, because it doesn't cost a lot more and some people just feel safer doing it. So it's a cheap way to slightly theoretically increase your security against future unknown attacks. Books about cryptography, yeah, lots of them. I'm linking one in the first lecture, so you can have a look at that. It's also linked on the website, but there are really, depending on what you're interested in, tons of good books. In questions that I skip over quickly here, you can also ask them again on Discord or so, and I'll try to answer in more detail there. Possible to detect whether Eve is listening. In most circumstances, not easily, but that's not a crypto question, so I can't go in much detail. Why is it not reversible? I can show you an illustration for why it's not reversible on Discord, but we'll also have a look at the primitives inside, so the reason why it's not reversible in the next lecture. Would it be right to say that 100 bits is enough to make sure that your password doesn't get cracked, but blah, 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 blah. So this one is referring a bit to a sort of multi-user security. So there is some truth to this. I can't go into much detail due to lack of time, but in essence, if you want to make sure that nobody in a system is attacked, one of the ways to do this is to increase keys. What if the last block is smaller? You do this padding stuff. Actually, you do the padding always, even if the last block is a full multiple of 512. So you simply add some bits at the end that also go into the hash. Being padded, yes indeed. I think I have to ask to answer the remaining questions on Discord because I really need to get out of the room. But I'll be sure to answer that afterwards. Okay, thanks a lot for the many questions. Actually, a lot more than I expected. And I hope you have a great afternoon where you will also get introduced to the KU task. A final reminder, the KU team registration deadline is also today. So please don't forget about that. I hope you have a great lunch and enjoy the exercises afterwards. And see you next week. Bye.